Marcella Turner rose from the clerk's table with her ledger still open in her hands and said, loud enough for the whole trading post yard to hear, that Aldous Crane had stolen 31 ballots belonging to the Spanish-speaking ranchers of Alcala Precinct, and that she could prove it. The yard went quiet the way a room goes quiet before a thunderclap. Dust hung in the late afternoon light, gold and gritty, already tinged faintly gray from a wildfire burning somewhere to the west in the Sawtooth Divide, and 200 men and women who had come down from the Larkspur County ranches to watch the count turned as one body to look at her. Marcella did not flinch. She had spent the better part of the day writing down the choices of men who could not write English themselves, reading the ballot language back to them in Spanish so there could be no mistake, and she knew her own numbers the way she knew her own name. That is a serious accusation to make against an elected officer of this county, Miss Turner, Aldous Crane said. He was a broad, silver-whiskered man in a good black coat, and he had built the Pinnacle Pass trading post up from a single sod room to the largest structure between Draper Falls and the Mountain Pass, and most of the county owed him money at one time or another, which was a kind of power all its own. I'd be careful accusing a man of theft without evidence, especially a woman in your position. Your work here depends on this county's good opinion. I have the evidence, Marcella said, and held up the ledger. I recorded 31 names and 31 marks this morning at the Alcala Precinct box in the presence of the precinct judge. That box was carried here sealed. When it was opened an hour ago, 22 ballots were inside. 9 votes are simply missing, and when I asked to see the returns from the noon collection, your clerk told me there was no noon collection. There is no ledger for it, because there was never supposed to be a paper trail. A murmur went through the crowd, the kind that could tip toward outrage or toward disbelief, depending on which way the next voice fell. It was Jeremiah Wells who spoke next, and later Marcella would think that was the moment the whole shape of her life bent in a new direction, though at the time she only registered that a low, steady voice she had not heard in 7 years was speaking her name into the argument like a hand set gently at the small of her back. "She's telling the truth," Jeremiah said, stepping out from beside his string of horses. He had come down from the Wells place that morning with 3 mares to trade and had stayed to vote, and he had seen, without thinking much of it until this moment, a rider in a company hat take a canvas satchel off the tail of the wagon that carried the Alcala box, well before the wagon reached the counting table. I watched a man take a bag off that wagon before it ever got to this yard. I thought he was running an errand for Mr. Crane. I didn't think anything of it until Miss Turner just said the number that bag would hold. Crane's jaw tightened just slightly, just enough that Marcella, who had spent years reading faces in 2 languages, because words alone were never the whole truth, saw it and understood that Jeremiah Wells had just told the exact truth Crane had been counting on nobody noticing. "That's a considerable leap from seeing a man carry a bag to accusing me of election fraud," Crane said, recovering his voice, pitching it toward the crowd rather than toward Jeremiah. "Folks, I have run this county's business honestly for 11 years. I will not stand here and be slandered by a Mexican vaquero and a half-breed translator girl who's known to keep company with him." There was a ripple of ugliness in that, the kind of word thrown out to change the subject from facts to blood, and Marcella felt the old, familiar heat of it rise in her chest, not shame. She had burned shame out of herself a long time ago, but a clean and useful anger. "I am not known to keep company with anyone, Mr. Crane," she said evenly, "and my parentage has nothing to do with arithmetic. 9 ballots are missing from 1 precinct. That is not slander. That is a number, and I will show it to anyone in this county with the patience to count it themselves." Sheriff Otis Bragg, who had been standing near the counting table with the look of a man wishing very hard he were somewhere else, cleared his throat and said that the matter would have to go before the county clerk properly, in Draper Falls, and that nobody was arresting anybody on the strength of a missing bag. It was, Marcella understood even as she nodded her agreement, exactly the kind of answer that let the day end without anything actually being settled, and she watched Aldous Crane's shoulders ease slightly at the sheriff's caution, the way a man eases when he has been given one more day to hide what needs hiding. The crowd began to break up into knots of talk, and it was in the loosening of that crowd that Marcella finally let herself look directly at Jeremiah Wells, who had already been looking at her. He had grown into himself in the years since she had last seen him standing in the yard of a stage stop outside San Angelo, a restless, laughing boy of 22 who broke horses for a living, and had once ridden 11 miles in a hailstorm to bring her father a bottle of liniment for a bad knee. Only, she had always suspected, so that he might have a reason to sit at their table for supper. He was quieter now, and steadier, weathered brown from the sun in the particular way of a man who has spent every day of his adult life outdoors, with a short black beard he had not worn as a young man, and a stillness to him that had not been there before. She remembered a boy who used to talk too fast and laugh too easily. This man watched more than he spoke. "Marcella Turner," he said, and something in the way he said her full name, both parts careful and complete, made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I heard you'd gone north with your father's work. I didn't know it had brought you here." "My father died 3 winters ago in Wyoming," she said. "I kept on with the work myself. The Indian Agency needed someone who could carry Spanish and enough Crow to be useful at the treaty councils, and Mr. Crane's post needed someone to read contracts to the ranchers who couldn't read them in English. I have been at Pinnacle Pass since spring." She studied him. "You look like you've done well for yourself, Jeremiah Wells." "My father passed too," he said, 4 years back. "I run the place now such as it is. My mother and my sister keep the house, I keep the cattle and the horses." He glanced toward Crane, who was already moving off toward his store with 2 of his hired men, flanking him like an honor guard he had bought and paid for. "I didn't come here today to make trouble for that man, but I saw what I saw, and I wasn't going to stand there and let you say a true thing and have nobody stand up beside you." "You may have made trouble for yourself all the same," Marcella said. "He does not forget faces." "No," Jeremiah agreed. "I don't imagine he does." That evening the smoke smell was stronger, drifting down off the divide on a wind that had shifted twice since noon, and half the yard talked of the fire burning in the high timber more than they talked of the missing ballots, because a fire far off was still, for the moment, someone else's trouble, while an election was everyone's business whether they wanted it to be or not. Marcella walked the half-mile from the post to the small cabin she rented from a widow named Ackerley, and found Jeremiah Wells waiting near the gate with his hat in his hands, which struck her as such an old-fashioned courtesy that she almost laughed before she caught herself, because there was nothing funny in what they had begun that afternoon. "I want to help you get proof," he said, without any preamble at all, which she remembered now had always been his way, to come straight at a thing rather than circle it. "Real proof, the kind that holds up in drape or falls in front of the county clerk, not just my word and your ledger, which Crane will say between the 2 of us is just a courtship dressed up as testimony." "It is not a courtship," Marcella said, more sharply than she intended, and then, because she had never been a woman who pretended not to notice her own feelings even when it would have been easier, she added more gently, "Though I confess I am glad to see you again, Jeremiah, whatever this turns out to be." "I'm glad to see you too," he said simply. "Now tell me what proof would satisfy a county clerk, because I don't know the law, but I know cattle and I know horses and I know how to get a person from one place to another fast when it needs doing, and I expect between the 2 of us we can find a way to be useful." Marcella considered him in the failing light. There was a directness in him that had not been there when he was 22, or perhaps it had always been there, and simply had nowhere yet to go. "The precinct returns are supposed to be copied in triplicate," she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "1 copy stays with the local judge, 1 goes to the county clerk in Draper Falls, and one is posted publicly at the precinct for 10 days so any citizen may inspect it. If Crane altered the count here at the post, he would still have had to falsify the copy that goes to Draper Falls, because the clerk there keeps the official book of record for the whole territory to certify. If his numbers do not match between the copy posted here and the copy filed there, that discrepancy is proof no man can argue away, because it is his own hand caught contradicting itself. Then we ride to Draper Falls, Jeremiah said. It is a full day's ride each way, Marcella said. 26 miles by the wagon road, less if a rider knows the game trails through the foothills. I know the game trails, Jeremiah said. My mother's family has run cattle through this basin longer than there's been a Draper Falls to ride to. They left before dawn 2 days later, when the posted precinct return had been up long enough for Marcella to copy it faithfully into her own ledger, word for number for tally mark, in a clean, careful hand that would stand up beside any clerk's book in the territory. The morning was hazy even before the sun cleared the ridge. A thin brown veil laid over everything, and Jeremiah studied the sky the way a sailor studies weather. "Wind's been coming down off the divide 3 days running," he said as he checked the cinch on Marcella's borrowed mare, a sturdy bay named Elizana that belonged to his mother. "If it backs around out of the south before this is over, that fire's not going to stay up in the high timber. It'll come down into the grass, and grass burns faster than a man can run." "You sound like you've seen it happen before," Marcella said. "I have," he said, and did not elaborate, and she did not press him, understanding without being told that some memories a person carries privately, the way she carried certain memories of her own, of a stage stop and a boy who laughed too easily and a father who was gone now and could never again call her in to supper. The ride to Draper Falls took them along a wagon road that climbed and fell through cottonwood draws and open grass gone gold and dry with the season, and Marcella found, somewhat to her surprise, that she liked riding beside Jeremiah Wells in a way that had nothing to do with the old fondness she remembered, and everything to do with the man he had actually become. He rode the way some men breathed, without appearing to think about it at all, and when her mare shied at a rattlesnake sunning itself across the trail, he was already between the snake and the horse before Marcella had fully registered the danger, his own gelding sidestepping the coiled shape with an unhurried economy that spoke of long practice. "You ride Spanish style," she observed, watching the way he held the reins loose in one hand, the way his weight settled into the stirrup. "My mother's father broke horses for the ranchos south of the Rio Grande before he ever crossed north," Jeremiah said. "He taught my mother, and she taught me, before my father ever put a rope in my hand. There's a right way to ask a horse for something and a wrong way, and the right way looks like you're not asking at all. Is that how you intend to ask the county clerk for the truth?" Marcella said, and he laughed, a short surprised sound, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the yard 2 days before. "I expect the county clerk will need asking a little more directly than a horse does," Jeremiah admitted. They stopped at midday to eat cold biscuit and dried beef beside a creek where the water ran low and clear over smooth stones, and Marcella spread her copy of the precinct return on a flat rock to check it once more against her ledger while Jeremiah watered the horses. She was aware of him watching her work, not idly but with genuine attention, and when she looked up he did not glance away. "You write like your father wrote," he said. "I remember his hand from the letters he used to draft for the ranchers who came through. Careful, like every word cost something and he meant to spend it well. Taught me that the wrong word in a treaty or a deed could start a war or lose a family their land," Marcella said. "He was careful because carelessness with words is a kind of violence, even if nobody ever draws a gun over it. I have tried to keep his standard." "You have," Jeremiah said. "I saw it in that yard. You didn't shout. You didn't call him a thief and leave it there. You gave a number. He was quiet a moment. That's a rare thing, to trust a number to do the work of an accusation. Most folks want the shouting." "Shouting starts fights," Marcella said. Numbers end them if enough people are willing to look at them honestly. My work at the treaty councils taught me that too. A mistranslated word between a soldier and a Crow elder has gotten men killed before now. I would rather be accused of being cold than be the reason somebody reaches for a rifle because I chose an exciting word over an accurate one. Jeremiah studied her for a long moment, something unguarded moving across his face. "I don't think you're cold," he said. "I think you're the most careful, brave person I ever met, and I thought that about you 7 years ago too, before I had the sense to know what it meant." Marcella felt the color rise in her own face and busied herself refolding the ledger to hide it, though she suspected he saw anyway. "We should ride on," she said. "We're losing daylight." They reached Draper Falls in the last hour before sunset, a town of perhaps 400 souls strung along a single wide street with the county courthouse at its head, a squat frame building with a flag hanging limp in the smoky, windless evening air. The county clerk, a thin, ink-stained man named Prentice, was closing his office for the day when they arrived, and it took the better part of an hour and a fair amount of patient explanation from Marcella, in the calm, procedural language she used at treaty councils, before he agreed to open the official book of returns and let them compare it against the copy Marcella carried. The numbers did not match. Where the precinct copy posted at Pinnacle Pass showed 31 ballots cast at Alcala Precinct with the votes divided 22 for the Reform candidate Henry Also and 9 for Aldous Crane's chosen man, the official copy filed with the county clerk showed only 22 ballots cast in total, with all 22 recorded for Crane's candidate. "That is not a clerical error," Marcella said quietly, looking at the 2 pages side by side. "That is a rewriting." Prentice looked uneasy. "I only file what's brought to me, Miss Turner. I don't ride out and watch the counting myself." "No one is accusing you, Mr. Prentice," Marcella said. "But this discrepancy must be entered into the record, and a formal complaint filed with the Territorial Election Board, and I will need a certified copy of both pages to carry back with me." It took another hour of careful, patient insistence, but by the time Prentice finally pressed his seal onto the certified copies, Marcella had the beginning of what she needed, and Jeremiah had watched her work the way, she thought, he might watch a rider work a difficult horse, with a kind of respect that had nothing grudging in it at all. They stayed the night at a boarding house at opposite ends of the hall, and Marcella lay awake longer than she wanted to admit, listening to the wind pick up outside, thinking not of Aldous Crane at all but of the way Jeremiah Wells had said her name in the yard, both parts, careful and complete. The ride back to Pinnacle Pass the next day carried a different weight than the ride out, the certified papers folded inside Marcella's coat like something that might catch fire on their own if handled roughly, though the truer fire, the one in the mountains, had grown considerably closer overnight. They could see it now without needing to guess, a low brown-orange smear along the ridgeline to the west, and the smoke had thickened enough that the sun set behind a copper haze an hour before it should have. "That's moved a good 5 miles since yesterday," Jeremiah said, reining his gelding to study it. "Wind still coming out of the west, thank God, or it'd already be down in the basin." News of their evidence outran them, as news in a small county always does, and by the time they rode into Pinnacle Pass the following afternoon, a crowd had already gathered at the trading post, drawn by rumor that the missing ballots had been found written into the county's own book. And this time it was not Crane who spoke first but Henry Alsop himself, a lean, sun-cracked rancher who had run against Crane on a platform of honest water rights and fair grazing leases. Standing on the porch steps of the post, with a look of cautious hope on his face that Marcella found herself hoping she would not have to disappoint. She read the 2 certified pages aloud to the assembled crowd, first in English and then, because half the crowd were vaquero families who worked the Alcala precinct, and deserved to hear it in the language they trusted most, in Spanish, her voice steady and unhurried even as she felt the tension in the yard rise around her like heat off a stove. Crane, when he emerged from his store to face the crowd, had clearly had time to prepare a response, and it was better prepared than Marcella had expected. He produced his own ledger, a second book Marcella had never seen before, and declared that it was Marcella Turner's original tally that had been falsified, not the county record, and that she had done so out of a personal attachment to Jeremiah Wells and a wish to see the Vaquero family's votes inflated beyond their true number. "I have kept my own careful count of every ballot cast at this post," Crane said, holding the book up for the crowd to see, though not close enough for anyone to actually read it. "It matches the county record precisely. It is Miss Turner's ledger that stands alone, unwitnessed by anyone save herself and a man she has admitted to keeping close company with. I ask this county, whose word carries more weight, an officer 11 years in this county's service, or a woman new among us whose objectivity is, shall we say, compromised." The crowd's mood, which had been tilting toward Marcella and Alsop, wavered visibly, and Marcella felt the ground shift under her feet in a way no horse or river ever had. Sheriff Bragg, sensing the turn, announced that in light of conflicting evidence he could not in good conscience order any change to the standing count until the territorial board could investigate properly, which might take weeks in which Crane's man would sit certified as the winner regardless of the truth underneath it. It was, Marcella understood with a cold clarity, exactly the kind of reversal a careful liar builds for himself in advance. A second book kept ready against the day the first fraud was discovered, and she had no way, standing in that yard with the light going strange and coppery from the smoke overhead, to prove her ledger true and his false, not without some third witness neither of them controlled. That night, alone in her cabin, she allowed herself, for the first time since the yard 2 days before, to feel something close to despair, and it was Jeremiah who found her there, having walked from the post in the dark to make certain she was not sitting alone with it. "He's a careful man," Jeremiah said, standing in her doorway with his hat again in his hands. "But careful men build their lies out of paper, and paper burns and tears and gets left places by other hands. He didn't do this alone. Somebody kept his books for him. Somebody wrote in that second ledger." "His clerk," Marcella said slowly. "Walter Prout, the young man who works the store counter. I have seen him flinch every time Crane raises his voice at him." "Then maybe it's time somebody besides Crane asked Walter Prout what he knows," Jeremiah said. They found the next morning that Walter Prout had already left the post, sent by Crane on some invented errand to the old Sibley line, shack 2 miles up the far side of Willow Ford, ostensibly to fetch supplies for a trapper who did not exist, in what both Marcella and Jeremiah recognized at once as an attempt to put the young man somewhere quiet and inconvenient, until the matter of the election had settled itself in Crane's favor. And it was while they stood arguing whether to ride after him that the wind, which had held steady out of the west for 4 days, backed suddenly around to the south, and within the hour the sky over Pinnacle Pass had gone the color of a bruise, and someone on the ridge above the post began ringing the old warning bell that hung outside the blacksmith's shed. 3 fast strokes repeated, the signal every rancher in the basin had agreed upon years before for fire. The next hours passed in the particular blurred urgency of an evacuation, wagons hitched in haste, stock driven out of corrals toward the creek bottoms where the grass was thinner and less likely to carry flame, women and children loaded onto whatever would hold them and sent east down the wagon road away from the smoke. Marcella found herself helping load an elderly couple's belongings onto a borrowed cart, even as her mind stayed fixed on Walter Prout, alone at a lined shack on the wrong side of a river with a wildfire coming down off the divide, and she suspected, the one piece of paper that could prove Aldous Crane a thief and set an honest man in his rightful office. "He'll be caught between the fire and the ford if nobody warns him," she said to Jeremiah, finding him at the corral fence directing his mother's cattle toward the creek with 2 of his vaqueros. "Someone has to ride for him. "I'll go," Jeremiah said immediately. "We'll go," Marcella said. "You know the ford. I know what questions to ask him and what a false answer sounds like against a true one. If we bring him back without the truth in his own words, Crane will only call it another lie of mine." Jeremiah looked at her for a long moment, weighing, she understood, not her competence, which he did not seem to doubt, but the danger, and finding at last that he trusted her judgment of her own courage more than he trusted his own fear for her. "Then we ride hard," he said, "and we don't stop to argue about it again." They crossed the basin at a pace that left Marcella's lungs burning with smoke and effort both. The fire's glow visible now even in daylight along the ridgeline to their right, close enough that they could hear, faintly, the crackle and roar of it carried on the wind, a sound like a great animal breathing. Willow Ford, when they reached it, was crossed by an old log trestle bridge, built decades before by trappers and never properly maintained since, its timbers gray and cracked, and the river beneath it ran low with the late summer drought but fast where it narrowed between rock shelves, dark and cold even under the strange orange sky. They found Walter Prout on the far bank already, having heard the fire bell from the shack, and started back on foot when his mule threw a shoe on the rocky trail, and he came stumbling toward them across the bridge with a canvas satchel clutched to his chest and terror plain on his young face. "I have it," he called across the water, his voice cracking. "I kept my own true copy, Miss Turner, I swear it. I couldn't stand what Mr. Crane made me write, so I kept the real numbers hid under the shack floorboards. I was going to bring it to you when I found the courage. I swear on my mother's grave I was." The bridge shuddered under his feet as he spoke, a support timber on the upstream side, weakened by years of flood and drought and now by heat radiating ahead of the fire itself, giving way with a crack like a rifle shot. And Walter Prout dropped to his knees on the tilting deck, one leg through a gap where the plank had simply vanished into the current below. "Don't move," Jeremiah shouted, already off his horse, already uncoiling the lariat from his saddle with the same unhurried economy Marcella had watched him use on the trail days before, except now his hands moved fast, sure, practiced on 1,000 cattle and never once, Marcella understood with her heart in her throat, on a man's life before this moment. "Marcella, take my horse's rope around that boulder there, quick as you can, and hold it steady, don't let it slip." She did not ask why or argue the order. She simply moved, looping the second coil of rope Jeremiah threw her around the broad gray boulder at the near bank, and bracing her boots against the rock the way she had seen him brace against a fence, post to hold a spooked steer, understanding without being told that she was building the anchor his rescue would depend on. Jeremiah went out onto the bridge on foot, testing each plank with his weight before committing it, the structure groaning and shedding another timber into the river even as he moved, until he was close enough to throw the loop of his lariat over Walter Prout's shoulders and cinch it tight beneath his arms. "Hold onto the rope, not me," Jeremiah called, backing carefully toward the bank, taking up the slack hand over hand. "Marcella, when I say pull, you pull with everything you've got, and don't you let go of that anchor line for anything." The middle section of the bridge went next, a whole span of it folding downward into the current in a shower of splinters and spray, and for one terrible instant Walter Prout hung suspended over open water with nothing beneath him but the rope, his satchel still clutched in one white-knuckled hand, and Marcella heard herself shouting encouragement to him in Spanish before she even realized she had chosen the language. Some instinct in her reaching for the words that would soothe rather than the words that would simply inform. "Agarrate fuerte, you Cassie. Hold on, you are almost there, hold on." Jeremiah pulled, and Marcella pulled against the anchor rope with her whole body, feet skidding in the loose gravel of the bank, and between the two of them and the strength of Jeremiah's gelding, which had been trained to hold steady against exactly this kind of strain from years of dragging calves to branding fires, they hauled Walter Prout clear of the collapsing bridge and onto solid ground, not 3 seconds before the entire remaining structure gave way behind him and crashed into the river. timbers spinning away downstream in the current, cutting off the far bank entirely. Walter Prout lay coughing and shaking on the gravel, the satchel still gripped in his hand, and Marcella knelt beside him, checking with quick, practiced hands for broken bones, finding none, finding instead a young man weeping with relief and shame in equal measure. "I have it," he said again, pushing the satchel toward her. "The real count. Every ballot, every precinct in my own hand, the copies I made before Mr. Crane made me burn the true book and write a false one in its place. I was afraid of him. I am still afraid of him. But I could not stand to watch you called a liar for telling a truth I helped hide." Marcella opened the satchel with careful, trembling fingers, and found the papers inside wrapped in oilcloth, dry despite the spray that had soaked her own sleeves to the elbow, and she felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the moment Crane produced his second ledger in the yard. She looked up and found Jeremiah watching her, soaked and smoke-stained and breathing hard from the effort of the rescue, and something passed between them in that look that had no need of words at all, a recognition of what they had just done together, each depending utterly on the other and neither found wanting. "We should get him to the creek bottoms with the others," Jeremiah said finally, his voice rough. "That fire's not waiting on us to finish being amazed at each other." They rode double, Walter Prout sharing Jeremiah's gelding while Marcella led on the bay mare with the satchel of true ballots secured inside her coat, and they reached the gathering point at Beaver Creek, an hour before the fire crested the near ridge and came roaring down into the dry grass of the basin, exactly as Jeremiah had predicted 3 days before. What followed was not romance but labor, hard and communal and entirely necessary. And Marcella found herself, still soaked to the elbow and smelling of smoke and river water, working a plow line beside a dozen other women and men, cutting a fire guard through the tall dead grass, while the men on horseback set careful backfires along the break to rob the wildfire of fuel before it could reach the creek bottom where the stock and the wagons were sheltering. Jeremiah rode the line all afternoon, directing riders with the same calm authority he had shown on the collapsing bridge. And once, passing near her, he reined in long enough to press a canteen into her hands and say nothing at all, only look at her for a moment with an expression she did not need translated in any language. The fire, checked by the fire guard and by a mercy of wind that finally died with the sun, burned itself out along the ridge above Beaver Creek without ever reaching the trading post or the outlying ranches, though it left the high timber of the divide a smoking ruin that would smolder for a week, and it left every soul in the basin coughing and exhausted, and in a way Marcella had not expected, drawn closer together for having survived a shared danger. 2 days later, with the smoke thinning and the immediate threat past, the community gathered again at Pinnacle Pass, this time not merely to hear an accusation but to witness a reckoning. Marcella stood before the crowd with Walter Prout beside her, pale but resolute, and read into the record, in English and then in Spanish, the true count from every precinct in Larkspur County, precinct by precinct, showing plainly where Aldous Crane's falsified figures diverged from the honest tally, and Walter Prout confirmed each discrepancy in his own halting voice, admitting under the weight of his own conscience and the evident relief of finally speaking that Crane had ordered the destruction of true ballots and the fabrication of false ones in no fewer than 4 precincts, always the precincts where Spanish-speaking ranchers or small homesteaders had voted heavily for reform. Sheriff Bragg, who had spent the fire and the 2 days since watching the community's mood shift decisively away from Crane and toward Alsop, no longer had the luxury of caution, and when Henry Alsop's own examination of Crane's store ledgers, undertaken with a warrant finally granted by a territorial judge in Draper Falls, revealed that Crane had also been skimming filing fees from homestead claims for years, quietly pocketing money that should have gone to the Territorial Land Office. The matter passed beyond any possibility of denial. Crane was arrested within the week, his election voided by order of the territorial board, and Henry Alsop was certified county commissioner in a special session that Marcella herself was asked to record for the official minutes, an irony she savored privately without ever mentioning it aloud. "You did this," Jeremiah said to her, the evening after the special session as they walked together along the creek below the trading post, the water running low and clear now that the fire's threat had passed, the willows along the bank still faintly smelling of smoke but green and alive beneath it. "Your numbers, your careful, patient numbers." "We did this," Marcella corrected him. "I would have had nothing but a ledger no one believed if you had not stood up first in that yard, and if you had not gone out on that bridge for Walter Prout while it fell apart beneath your boots." "I went out on that bridge because you were holding the rope," Jeremiah said. "I never doubted for one moment you'd hold it." Marcella stopped walking and looked at him, and found him already looking at her with an openness he had not quite allowed himself in the yard 7 years before, when he had been a laughing boy who did not yet know what he wanted, and she had been a shy girl who had not yet learned to trust her own voice. "I want to show you something," Jeremiah said, somewhat abruptly, as though he had been working up the courage to say it for days and had only now found the nerve. "It's not far. Would you ride out with me tomorrow before you're needed back at the post?" "For what purpose?" Marcella asked, though something in his sudden nervousness made her suspect she already half knew the answer would not be a simple one. "I'd rather show you than explain it," Jeremiah said. "Please, Marcella." She agreed, curiosity and something warmer than curiosity both pulling at her, and the next morning they rode out together along the creek road toward the low bluff where the Wells family homestead stood, a modest but solid log house that Jeremiah's father had built 20 years before, and that Jeremiah himself had kept in careful repair since his father's death, its corrals full of good horses and its pastures thick with cattle bearing the family's brand. But it was not the house Jeremiah led her toward. He turned instead down a fork of the trail she had not noticed before, half a mile further along the bluff, to a smaller cabin she had never seen, freshly chinked and roofed, clearly built new within the past year, standing alone above a bend in the creek with a view west toward the mountain pass and the smoke-hazed ridges beyond. And across the whole front of that small cabin, running the width of it and roofed over to keep off rain and snow both, stood a porch, wide and sturdy and carefully made. With turned posts he must have shaped himself on a lathe, and a railing smooth enough that Marcella ran her hand along it without thinking, and 2 rocking chairs already set at one end, angled to look out over the creek and the pass beyond, as though someone had built this place imagining, quite specifically, the 2 people who might someday sit there together to watch the light change on the mountains. "I bought this parcel from a homesteader who gave up and went back east the spring after my father died," Jeremiah said, watching her take it in, his voice unsteady in a way she had not heard from him even on the collapsing bridge. "I told myself I was building it up as an investment, another piece of the ranch. But I built that porch this summer, plank by plank, on the days I could spare from the herd, and I never once let myself say out loud who I was building it for, because I hadn't the right to say it, not until I knew whether the woman I was thinking of even remembered me, let alone whether she'd ever consider staying in a place like this." "Jeremiah," Marcella said softly, her hand still resting on the smooth wood of the railing. "I'm not asking you to answer me today," he said quickly, as though afraid to let the silence stretch long enough for a refusal to form in it. "I only wanted you to see it. I wanted you to know that whatever happens between us, I built this with you in mind long before I had any right to hope you'd want it, and I would rather you see the porch and say no honestly than never see it at all and wonder." Marcella walked the length of the porch slowly, running her fingers along the railing, feeling the careful joinery of it, the evident hours of patient, hopeful labor, and she thought of her father's careful hands over his ledgers, of the way he had always said that the truest measure of a man was not in what he said he would do, but in what he actually built with his own 2 hands when no one was watching to praise him for it. She thought of the yard at Pinnacle Pass, and the collapsing bridge, and the fire guard cut through dry grass at Beaver Creek, and every hour of the past weeks in which Jeremiah Wells had shown her, again and again, without ever once demanding that she notice, exactly the kind of man he had grown into. She turned to find him standing at the porch steps, hat in his hands again, watching her with a hope he was clearly trying very hard not to let show too plainly on his face and failing entirely. "It has a fine view of the pass," Marcella said, and heard her own voice catch. "I have always wanted a porch with a fine view. My father used to say a person could tell everything about how a man intended to treat a woman by whether he built the house first or the porch first, because a house is for shelter, but a porch is for sitting together and watching the world, and a man who builds the porch is a man who means to keep you close, not just keep you safe." "Does that mean," Jeremiah said carefully, "that you might consider sitting on it from time to time?" "It means," Marcella said, coming to stand before him at the top of the steps, close enough now that she could see the fine lines of worry and hope both etched around his eyes, "that I would like very much to live here, Jeremiah Wells, if the offer includes you along with the porch and not merely the view." "It has always included me," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "There was never any version of this I built that didn't." He kissed her then, there on the new porch with the mountains hazy and healing behind them and the creek running clear below. And it was not the hurried, laughing kiss a boy of 22 might once have stolen at a stage stop years before, but something slower and surer. The kiss of two people who had each spent years becoming exactly who they needed to be before they were ready to find each other again. And Marcella thought, with the small, precise part of her mind that never entirely stopped keeping records even in moments like this one, that this was a truth requiring no translation at all. They were married 5 weeks later, in late September, by a circuit preacher who came through Draper Falls twice a year and happened to be passing through Pinnacle Pass on his usual route. The ceremony held not at the post, but on the porch itself, with Refugio Wells standing proud beside her son and Jeremiah's younger sister, Luz weaving late wildflowers into Marcella's hair, and Henry also, newly seated as county commissioner, standing as witness alongside Walter Prout, who had found steady work as the new, honest clerk of Larkspur County, and who wept openly through most of the brief ceremony, declaring afterward that he had never in his life been so glad to see two people made happy by the same truth that had very nearly ruined him. It was, everyone agreed, a small wedding, held together with borrowed chairs and a wedding feast of venison and dried apple pie and strong coffee, and no one who attended it ever forgot the sight of the bride and groom afterward, sitting together in the 2 rocking chairs at the end of that porch, watching the last color drain from the sky above the pass while the guests danced to a single fiddle in the yard below, and neither of them said very much at all, because after everything the summer had asked of them, silence together had become its own kind of eloquence. The spring that followed brought its own small proof of how thoroughly they had become partners, rather than merely husband and wife in name. A dispute arose between a family of Crow Alatees grazing horses along the North Fork of the creek and a newly arrived homesteader named Garrity who claimed the same water rights under a filing he had made in Draper Falls, and both parties, wary of the bad blood such disputes had caused in other counties, sent word asking whether Jeremiah Wells and his wife might come and help sort the matter before it turned to gunplay, as such disputes too often did elsewhere in the territory. They rode out together on a clear morning in April, the mountains still capped white above pastures gone green again after the fire's long recovery, and Marcella sat between the two parties translating carefully, patiently, refusing to let either side's anger color her rendering of the other's words, while Jeremiah walked the actual ground with both men, reading the lay of the water and the old cattle trails with the eye of a man who had spent his whole life understanding exactly how land and water moved, and where a fair line might honestly be drawn between two families who each had real claim to what they needed. By afternoon, they had worked out a shared grazing schedule that satisfied both parties well enough that Garrity and the Crow elder, a quiet, dignified man named Bear Heart, shook hands over it without either side feeling they had surrendered anything essential. And as they rode back toward home in the long gold light of early evening, Marcella found herself laughing, unguarded and easy, at something Jeremiah had said about the particular stubbornness of homesteaders and horses both. "You are good at this," he said, watching her laugh with open pleasure. "Better than good. I have never once seen you choose the easy word over the true one, not in a whole year of watching you work." "You built me a porch to watch the pass from," Marcella said, reaching over to take his hand as their horses walked easily side by side down the trail toward the creek and the small cabin waiting beyond it, its rocking chairs still standing at the end of that same wide, sturdy porch, worn now with a full year's use, warm with a full year's happiness. "The least I owe you in return is careful work, and a true word, every single day for the rest of our lives." "That," Jeremiah Wells said, bringing her hand to his lips as the last light caught the pass gold and rose above them, "sounds like exactly the life I hoped I was building, the whole time I was driving those nails." And when they reached the cabin and dismounted in the blue hush of early evening, they climbed the porch steps together, as they had climbed them nearly every evening since the day she first saw it and agreed at last to stay, and sat down side by side to watch the mountains hold the last of the light. Two people who had found, in a hard season of fire and fraud and a river that nearly took everything, the one thing neither of them had quite dared to hope for again. A safe place, freely chosen, and someone steady enough to build it with.